Hey everybody, welcome back to Comparative Criminology. We're now starting section 10, which is all about the death penalty, which I understand can be a emotionally difficult and very controversial topic, but we're going to do our best to try to stick to the facts and the data and see what the death penalty actually is around the world, and then we'll talk specifically about how the United States does it, because they are kind of a special case. So, there we go. Every country in the world belongs to one of three groups: abolitionist, moratorium, or retentionist when it comes to the death penalty. Abolitionist means they've gotten rid of the death penalty and it's no longer used. There are two different kinds of abolitionist countries, though. There's abolitionist by law, which there's some law in the country that says the death penalty shall not be inflicted. And then there's by practice, which is where technically it's still legally allowed, but it hasn't happened in so long and doesn't look like it's going to happen. Maybe there's a country that says you can still get the death penalty for treason in time of war, but that hasn't happened in over 100 years. Well, then they're effectively abolitionist anyway, so we count them as abolitionists by practice. Now, a moratorium country is a country where the death penalty is still legally allowed, but it hasn't been used in a while, and there's some law or policy that says, look, we're going to take a break for a while. Like, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of it, but we're going to just not do one for now. And then finally, there's the retentionist countries, which are the ones who still actively use the death penalty. And as you can tell from this map, the retentionist countries are a minority. The majority by number of countries have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. The ones in the orange there are the abolitionists by practice, where they've abolished it for ordinary crimes, i.e. murder, rape, robbery, those kind of things. But they may still have it on the books for things like treason or, airline hijacking or something that's so rare as to be essentially abolitionist. And then the purple in this case are abolitionist in practice, which is essentially the moratorium countries where they haven't used it in a while, and there's either a formal or informal, we're really not going to use this. Now, that's more than 2/3 of all countries have gotten rid of it legally, and overall, there is a fairly steep downward trend. The peak of death penalty use around the world was in the mid-90s, along with the peak in crime. And ever since then, the world has gone on a fairly steep downward slope on how much of the death penalty is actually being applied. So in 2020, that number was down to 483. In the 90s, I want to say it was in like the 2000-ish range. So we've vastly cut down on our use of the death penalty as a species. Now, how are the executions that are still happening, how are they actually carried out? There are lots of different ways that we can conduct executions, tons of different ways in which we have conducted executions in the past. So this is just one little snapshot. This is the latest data I could find, and it's for 2020. And around the world, there were 5 different methods that were actually used. And you got to keep in mind, this is not necessarily the methods that are legally allowable in countries that retain the death penalty, but methods that were actually used in this 1 year, okay? And as you can see, the vast majority of all executions were either through firing squad or hanging, okay? Jurgen, is this upsetting to you? You don't like that? I'm sorry. Well, firing squad and hanging were by far the most popular forms of execution. Again, actually used, not necessarily on the books, but actually used. Lethal injection is kind of seen as kind of the most modern, cruelty-free, if that's a possible thing, method for implementing the death penalty. And then there, of course, one country performed a beheading, and one country performed an electrocution, which is a method invented in the early 20th century to be a more humane form of execution. But notably not on here are common methods of execution from the past, like the gas chamber. What else is not on there? The guillotine, not on there. And those have historically been very popular methods of executing the death penalty. Now, there are some countries and some instances where the death penalty is not only an option, it's mandatory. So, for instance, this is just one of a few different examples I could have pulled out, but Malaysia. In the country of Malaysia, you are required by law to receive the death penalty if you get convicted for murder, terrorist attack, drug trafficking, or possession of firearm and ammunition. And by far, the most common way to get the death penalty in that country is drug trafficking. Because as long as there's a demand for drugs, people are going to traffic in drugs, and thus, people are going to be drug trafficking in every country. And when these people get caught in the country of Malaysia, they get executed for that crime. Now, Europe. Europe has not had the death penalty for some time. Now, individual countries started outlawing the death penalty, I believe, even in the late 19th century, but at least, the beginning of the 20th century, a few different European countries had gotten rid of the death penalty again, either by law or by practice. But what controls it today is the European Convention on Human Rights, where the first part of that was passed in 1951. So we're talking about post-World War II. If you remember, the UN was created right post-World War II, and then there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, I think. But the group of European countries got together and said, this isn't enough. We want more. So they created the European Convention on Human Rights in 1951, which spelled out, even more so than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed by the UN, what human rights are and how countries need to respect them. And it's been added on to since. So, for instance, in 1985, they added the 6th protocol, or the 6th section of this European Convention on Human Rights, and that's the one that outlaws the death penalty. So now, if you want to be a member of the EU, you are legally barred from implementing the death penalty in your country. Now, we're going to move on and talk about the United States here in a minute. Thank you for watching.